Welcome to the Hopenning, the place where hope is happening, with your hosts Fran Cadrone and Marina Theron-Monnery. For more information about Fran and Marina, or to apply to be a guest on the show, please go to our website www.hopenning.com. The Hopenning is for informal purposes only and is based on the research of your hosts, Fran and Marina. They, as well as their guests, are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from this podcast, which is not intended to replace any professional medical advice or care by medical professionals you are currently utilizing. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today at this episode of The Hopenning, episode 86. And today we are so privileged to have a dear friend and colleague, Dorothy Drew, with us. Dorothy is coming to us from London, Canada, Ontario, and she's a former research librarian, and she helped researchers and graduate students to find and use information in database. Now she helps people to find root causes of their issues and problems in their mind. She helps them to use this awareness to help them transform their lives. She is especially excited when she helps somebody with physical issues. And after talking about to Dorothy before and finding out what exactly she's doing, I can tell you that she is absolutely amazing at finding healing and helping people heal. So Dorothy, thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I learned so much from just talking to people too. So
as we learn from you.
So Dorothy, you come to us from the other London, right? Marissa Peer, who taught us, the three of us, she's in the one over the ocean, but you're the one in Canada. But it's probably an equally distance from Alberta. So welcome, Dorothy.
Just about. In fact, the year I took it, there was two. There was one in England. There's a course in England, and there was a course in California. And it was actually less distance for me to fly to England than to go to California. So I started into RTT. I had, so I had this career as a librarian for 30 some years. I retired. And then on one of the Facebook groups, they're talking about cerebral palsy. And I had 3 children, and one was born natural childbirth, no problems, everything was normal. And then I had a horrible condition, a scary condition called placenta previa, which is a condition that causes about 10 women in Canada to die each year. So it was completely the opposite, and it was twins. And the second twin had extreme brain damage. And despite the brain damage, I mean, he's gone to university, he seems normal, but he's got a gap in his brain the size of a large orange. And then this woman on this group was talking about the amazing work Marissa has done with people with brain damage. And it's like, yeah, right. But I thought, okay, I'll try it. And she worked on my son, but because he has epilepsy, she wouldn't work on him unless I sat there with him, which was actually good because I would have been so skeptical. I would have probably refused not to be with him while this was being done to him. And he was about 30 at the time, so it's not like he was a kid, but it was amazing to watch. And this woman, she did the same thing. That's the only episode that Marissa has on YouTube where she has an actual class. And so this woman basically did the exact same, not regression, but the whole going through the brain, letting the brain work, all that kind of stuff. And during the session, Michael's hand was in a claw shape, which is very typical of anyone who's had a stroke. And cerebral palsy just means you had a stroke before you were the age of 18. And so Michael could use his hand if he looked at it. But as soon as he stopped looking at it, his brain no longer recognized it. That's the way the therapist described it to me. So by not having it recognized, not using it all the time, it atrophies. And so you'll see that people who have had a stroke, they often have claw-shaped hands, and they often are, if whatever their affected side was, becomes tighter. And it's because of this lack of recognition by their brain, the lack of using it. So for him to open his hand would have taken a lot of painful work with a physiotherapist. And during this hypnosis session, among many things that did happen to him, one of the things that happened was his hand opened up, completely opened up, and it stayed open for quite a while. And I looked at that and I was in awe. And I thought, I'm going to learn how to do this. So I went into RTT, and it was very different than what it is now. But back then, you could just sign up to do it online. You do the whole online course and everything. And then what they would advise you to do is just go out and practice. So you'd have your very first class, how to hypnotize somebody. And they say, go out and hypnotize people. They don't say that now. Now they say you only do it with other students and you're more careful. But so I did that. So one of the things I did was I memorized the regression. So I sort of sat in front of a mirror and I would say the regression spiel over and over and over again until I could do it without looking at my crib notes. So I had regression, and then because I have a background in biology, the healing vortex made a lot of sense. So with physical issues, it was a lot of stuff I already knew. So I learned regression, I learned healing vortex, and anyone who would sit still for me got it. So I would be on the bus and somebody tell me I've got a sore knee, I've got a sore elbow, and I would do the whole thing. Uh, and so I probably did like 80 people with healing vortex, just the hypnosis and healing vortex before I ever tried doing regression or anything like that. And so I knew that process really, really well. And people, it had such a great effect. And then I started to do regression, and then I got a client, and it was a woman I sort of knew, and I was doing her for quit smoking. And she did go. She was smoking about a carton a day, like not just a pack, hundreds of cigarettes a day. And so within a week, she was down to about 3 cigarettes. But I took that as failure. She's still smoking, not as what a great success to go from that much to that little. And so the next month I did another variation that Marissa teaches about quit smoking. And she was still smoking. Not much, but still she was smoking. And because to my way of thinking, if you smoke 1 cigarette a day, you're a smoker. And so the 3rd month I saw her, I said, well, I'm not going to try smoking. And by that time, I'd already gone to England, taken the course. I was much more confident and everything. So I did nail biting. And she was somebody who'd done nail biting all her life. And she was also someone who'd been abused as a child. She'd been sexually abused. She'd gone through several rapes. She was in, and so I went into RTT planning to do physical issues. And then I found, especially with women, so many people who had serious physical issues had also had sexual abuse at some point in their life. And I felt like I'm not really quite ready for this. So that was when I decided to actually go, and I did the 10 days live because I could have just done, the 4 days live. That's the way they did it back then. You did it online, and then if you did live, you had 4 days to, add to it. And then if you hadn't ever done any RTT ever before, you could do the 10 days. And I thought, I need the 10 days. And anyway, she quit nail biting. And then a month later, she wrote me this beautiful letter. Email wasn't so strong then. She actually wrote a handwritten letter to say she was still smoking, but she had been addicted to various drugs, and she was now off of drugs. And she hadn't even told me that she was on these drugs. I didn't do anything for her on drugs. I just did cigarettes. I did smoking. But I also worked on all this trauma, the sexual abuse, various things that had happened. And so she got off of the drugs. And that was amazing. And then another incident that happened a few months later. I worked on this man who started talking about his ex, and he was going into clear trauma, just recounting it. So even though he had split up with his ex like 20 years before, you could see just on the computer, you could see his blood pressure rising, you could see how upset he was getting. He was going through all this. And what struck me was that would have been me before RTT. And I'd always thought all the trauma I had with my ex-husband, it was all put away, it was, docked away, wasn't affecting my life. And so I never did an RTT session about my ex, but I did RTT about everything, about trauma, about all kinds of physical problems, about emotional problems. And that sort of healed me. And then when I was watching this man on the computer, I realized that's not me anymore. And that would have been me. So before RTT, and if I hadn't done RTT, probably still, if I talked about my ex-husband and what things happened while I was married, I would have been as distraught and as upset as if it happened to me yesterday. And because of RTT, I was in a place where I could say, this happened, this happened, this happened, this was done. And that it's just facts. It's not that emotional hurt. And when I realized that, I thought, if I never earn a penny from RTT, I have more than earned everything back that I put into it. And so yes, because of my background with biology and stuff and life experience, I really wanted to focus on the physical issues, except of course then there's lots of emotional issues. So now if I get someone who just has anxiety, it's like, oh, I work with them. It's like, oh, is that all we have to do? So with people with physical trauma, it's like you clear out a lot of the emotional trauma, and then you do a lot of the physical healing kind of stuff. And things like Crohn's disease have big, and with things like Crohn's disease, it's very iffy. I have some people have absolutely amazing results, and other people, it's like nothing happens. And
well, Dorothy, it was interesting what you said. And I liken it to a Jenga tower, right? And you pull one thing out and it stops smoking, and yet it affects the whole rest of the tower. So whether it's drug abuse or whether it's whatever relationship issues, you just pull that one thing out and everything starts to change.
That's a lovely description.
I was going to ask you if you would just explain healing vortex.
Right, I was going to ask the same. Yes.
Right.
Doesn't Marissa
You and
still
I
teach?
Yeah,
Healing vortex?
we know what it is. We know what it is.
I see. I see what you mean. Yes, of course.
Right.
Well, healing vortex was a method developed by Marissa Peer about imagining an energy field sort of floating around you like a huge vortex. And as this healing vortex, this energy comes through your body, it's spinning around. It would say start with your head, and everything in your brain that's hurting will be cleared away, released from your body, bring it down. And that's where you can actually do a lot of physical things, even for most people have problems with their eyes, they have problems with their teeth. So you work on all that. And then as you go through the body, if they have a sore shoulder, then you have this energy really concentrate on the muscles. If they've had a broken bone, you concentrate. But what I did find is a lot of people in Ontario, you start talking about this vortex spinning around and they think tornadoes. And so one of the classes we have this in RTT, there's these wonderful master classes, and the one on cancer, the woman talks about alternatives such as a healing pool. And she said that, and I thought, that's it. So for most people in Canada, I don't do healing vortex anymore unless they're really into understanding vortexes and energy idea, because it is a powerful image. I usually have them do a pool. And so you're sitting in the water and this energy from the water flows in and stuff. And also another variation that often really works is just having people sit in the sun, and they're watching the sun, they're feeling the heat of the energy coming onto them, and then the sun starts to set, and then I have time stops when the sun touches the horizon. Time stops, and all these photons of energy are pouring into their body, into every cell of their body. And then as they allow these photons of energy to come in, each cell, this is my biology background, right? So every cell can heal. And depending on the person, if they have strong feelings about spirituality, I'll even have them go into the cell. So if they go into the cell and into their DNA, and then they can go into an atom, and inside the atom, then they can connect with spirits or perhaps God or some being that they feel can give them answers or can give them help. And I give them time, they can ask any question they want, it'll be answered, and then bring them back out. And that has a very powerful, powerful kind of effect. And to just say it sounds weird.
I love it.
But for people in hypnosis, it's very, very, very powerful. And before I did the RTT, I was definitely not into anything like mysticism. That whole idea of going into your cells, connecting to God, that would not have appealed to me whatsoever. But when I was at the RTT class, the second day I was there, this other student came up to me and said, "Dorothy, your aura is wide open. You have to close it." And I was like, "What?" Anyway, she said, "Your aura is wide open. If you don't close it, you're leaking energy." I was very, very skeptical, but she gave me a couple of exercises to close my aura. And she did say, before you ever anytime you work with a client, you always close your aura. And anyway, that night I went out for supper with her and a bunch of other people who are much more into this spirituality, mysticism kind of belief than I was. And while we were there, I told them this story about what had happened when my sons were born. And my twins were born when I was 6 months pregnant. I started hemorrhaging, which is very, very typical. Part of the reason is that the placenta for me was over the vagina. So as the vagina was being jarred open, it was coming separate. Excuse me. And I was bleeding. And at one point, I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, a little bit of bleeding, and then it was horrible. And they came rushing, and they had 3 intravenous being pumped in. So not dripping it in, pumping it in. Excuse me. And they debated setting up a 4th pump. So they had a pump on both arms and one leg. And somebody came in and said, "We should just let her go." And, and I have no idea if it was a man or a woman, but I just heard this voice, "We should just let her go." And seeing the shock, there's a whole team of people working on me, and the shock on their face, like, they were all geared to keeping me alive, and being told to stop. And once that comment was made, I felt the spirit of my grandmother beside me. I had never told this story to anybody until like 30 some years later, and I was at the RTT course, and I told these women, and they said, "Of course your grandmother was with you." And what was more interesting was I knew my grandmother had been a nurse, but I found out later that she had been a midwife during the 1930s and 40s. So of course it made sense that the spirit of my grandmother would come. And once I felt the spirit of my grandmother beside me, I became really calm, and the hemorrhaging slowed down enough that they didn't have to have these pumps going into me. And this had been in the middle of the night, and they were able to plan surgery for the afternoon. And for the surgery, they had a team of doctors for one team, another team for the other baby, and a whole team for me. And if you know AGPAR, which is how they measure newborns, okay, well, the one boy had 0.5 and the other was 0. And so anyway, they only because I was in a hospital that had neonatal unit and stuff, they were revived, they were put in. So they were 2 pounds, 10 ounces, and they were shocked because twins at that gestation who are born premature are usually about a pound. So, but I'd known I was carrying twins almost from the beginning for a whole bunch of reasons. So I was eating for twins, which means 60 grams of protein a day. Do you know how hard it is to get 60 extra protein? 60 grams of protein. Anyway, so that was why they were 2 pounds. They were the size of normal single babies. And so even in the hospital, if they're at opposite ends of the ward, and if one stopped breathing, they'd start shaking the other one because they were so much the same. And when they came home, they're identical twins. And if I had to give them medicine when they came home at night, I had to wake them up to be sure of which one was which. When they were awake, they were completely, totally different, especially the one who had the cerebral palsy. And they said the best therapist he could possibly have was his other twin. So anyway, so I've had a lot of life experience with this kind of physical things, therapy, all that kind of stuff. And then meeting these women at the RTT and telling them this is my story of a spirit. And they completely believed me. And I didn't really, I think I expected skepticism and doubt, and they believed me. And I've had so many clients where they do have events and things where spirituality becomes really important. So that's partly why when I'm doing the healing vortex, healing pool, I often do this thing about asking for, and I try to remember beforehand, ask them what their beliefs are, but sometimes I forget, I just say it. And so, and it makes a difference for some clients. So I had one woman who she had bipolar, and I was like, I don't know if I can really work with you. And she said, well, I haven't had an episode for decades. So for about 40 years, she's been on medicine. She's on the lowest dose possible for bipolar because it's been so long. And so we went through, and the first scene where she heard voices, and she was married. Her husband often beat her. He had started beating their toddler, and she heard this voice telling her, get out, get out, get out. And she did get out. She did go to see her parents, but she was kind of feeling there's something wrong with me. I'm hearing voices. And I asked her, what would have happened if you had ignored the voice? And she said, in all those decades, no one had ever asked her that question, which to me is like the most obvious thing. What was the voice saying? What did it matter? What was the context? And she was really quiet for a while, and then she said, if I had stayed, I would have died. So that really made her think, there's a possibility. This is something that saved my life. And the second time, the only other time in her life she's heard voices, again telling her get out, she was also in a situation where she said, I would have died if I'd stayed. So
Dorothy, I have heard or read or something where prayer is us talking to God and intuition is God talking to us. So I think that in our modern world, we've been told, we're a little nutty if we start hearing voices, or to start questioning our mental health if we hear voices, or anything that could possibly mean that the conscious mind is not, there in control. And yet, you know,
I know.
in
I mean,
Pat's
you get
past,
goosebumps when you have a client who does this sort of talk about spirits. It's you have I have goosebumps whenever somebody talks about it, and for her, she sort of think, well, what if somebody had just asked her, what was the voice saying? What would have happened if you ignored it? Maybe she wouldn't have been on medication for all those decades, believing she was crazy instead of knowing I'm blessed. I was able to keep myself alive. I kept my son alive, and I, uh, I had a session just when COVID hit, and this guy from Toronto, he had an injury where he had fallen on the ice a few years before, and he had surgery, and he wasn't really recovered. He was in pain, and he was walking crooked, and they were talking about doing a hip replacement. And so he came to see me about his back because he didn't want to do the hip replacement. So he came and he wanted it in person. He was from Toronto, so he actually rented my gym studio, which was empty because of COVID. And and he said, "You don't have to do any of this crazy stuff on me. I just want my hip to." And I said, "Oh, we've got time. We're going to do the full thing." So he was in his 70s, and we went back to scenes that were relevant. Sadness. What was what? I think I asked him, What's the most important knowledge you need to understand about your hip? And his memory was of his grandmother. His grandmother had basically raised him when he was a child, and his grandmother died when he was a teenager. And I mean, he was sobbing the memory of losing his grandmother. And I gave him a chance to talk to his grandmother, and he felt it was such an amazing connection. And then so we went through all that spiel. I made him a recording for, letting go, believing in himself, going forward, the standard kind of recording. And then we did really a focus on his body. And I recorded it. So we did um, the healing pool, but with a real focus on his hip and what was going on. And so that's where some knowledge of physiology really helps, but it doesn't really matter because what matters is the person's words. So I asked him, what do you want your hip to do? What do you want your bones to do? So I wrote down, how he wants, his words of how he wanted his bones to work. And I just fed it back to him and made this recording. And I talked to him, months and months later, and he was still listening to that healing recording. And I think I talked to him about a year and a half later, and he was still listening to my recording because he said if he listened to my recording, he could walk without pain. And if he didn't listen to my recording, he would need painkillers. And what was significant was a few days after the session, he saw his physiotherapist, and the physiotherapist was saying, "Something's changed. Your joints moving. What's happened?" And of course, that relaxation, that opening everything up. And he never did need to have his hip replaced, and he started walking in a more balanced way. And so he said for sure, because of the hypnosis, he did not need to have that second surgery, which would have put him in bed for months and months longer. I've done quite a few for people who have had broken bones, and one was another RTT therapist, and it was right at Christmas time, and I think she'd also fallen on the ice, but anyway, somehow she'd fallen and she'd broken her ankle or some part of her bone, and they thought she was going to need to see an orthopedic surgeon and probably have to have a pin put in. So once you get metal pins put in your body, that becomes pretty serious. So I just did this whole thing. I didn't do regression on her. She was a therapist. But I did a whole lot about just envisioning that her bone was in perfect condition. And I just used an image that I forget where I came across it, this idea of healing crystals. So healing crystals are flowing into this crack in your bone, and then stem cells are able to come and attach to the healing crystals. And the healing crystals are sealing up the rupture and allowing the tissue to be in full connection, allowing the blood circulation to be perfect and all the things that you would want, that you want the muscles to be connecting, the muscles to be healing, and lots of calcium to be flowing into the bone and strengthening the bone, and just that kind of thing. And so she was listening to it multiple times a day for a week until she saw the surgeon. And she saw the surgeon. She said, "Oh, you don't need to have a pin. You're okay. You just need a cast." And so, I mean, there's no way to say, would she have needed the pin if she hadn't done the hypnosis and the recording?
You know what just struck me is how extremely powerful our minds are. And I think all our problems come from things that were suggested to us that is on the negative side. For example, think of anything. Why are you not as clever as your sister? Like something like that. And then you start to believe that, even though you just maybe learn differently than your sister, but it's just a suggestion. Or maybe tall girls don't get good men, or tall girls end up not, silly things. And it's just
as someone who's short, I would say that's horrible. But yeah, I mean,
the power
for
of
sure.
suggestion. So while you do, Dorothy, is reverse that, giving them new suggestions, better suggestions, and then creating that excitement and belief in it, so that when they're
and certainly for anything to do with health, I find that the recording really makes a difference. And so one of the things I did a lot at the beginning was I knew someone who lived in a geared income housing, the welfare. And so I would go visit her, and she'd go out to the hallway and drag people in. So I would work with like 3 or 4 people in an afternoon with a huge number of physical issues, emotional issues. Many of the women who were there had been raped at some point. And of course, they didn't have fantastic results, but it gave me a fantastic amount of experience. So by the time I was 2 or 3 months after I graduated, I'd probably worked on, with full RTT, several hundred people for physical issues, and so I was really with mixed results. So it was great experience, but it wasn't so great for my confidence, because a lot of these people, I mean, they just had too many things wrong with them. So when I worked with people who had like ordinary lives, who weren't in poverty, who who simply had this broken bone or something, it would just be so much easier to work with them. But
Dorothy, what you're saying reminds me of Dr. Gabor Mate, who works with street people, addicted street people in Vancouver. And he's written a book about it, right? And the trauma these street people had in their childhoods, and now they're on the street, and they have infections, they have broken bones, they have all the things that everybody else does, except we go and get medical care. And
they have no money, they have no stable living place, they have nothing.
They can't.
Did you hear Gabor Mate said that every single female patient he had who was a street person had been raped as a child? Every single one. And so for a long time, it seemed every woman I had, no matter what she came to me for, would have some scene involving rape. And I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to specialize in. And that went on for like several months, and then it stopped. So in the year or 2 since, I haven't had any woman who has had that as a specific scene, unless she's come to me because of rape. And then for a long time, it seemed everyone I worked with, they'd come to me, "Oh, I'm having a problem with confidence," or "I have problems, I need to find a job." And then they would turn out, well, they also have Crohn's, or they have some kind of bowel disorder, or and they would be surprised. "Oh, you can help me with that?" Because the belief is that something like hypnosis is just for emotional problems. And so anyways,
the body is not just a body. Like you were talking about before, you talked about the photons and the light and the spirit. Well, the body is physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. We're one unit.
So
And
I did work, and he was even kind enough to make a lovely video for me about he had terrible eczema, terrible skin problems. So I did a session about him, and that cleared it up, but it still had a little bit. So we did another session about it, and it cleared up, and then everything seemed to be fine. And then several months later, he called me up and said, "Well, you know, I'm having all this problem with." Uh, I think it was his hip, his back or something. It was a bone problem. And we went back. So I said to him, "What's going on?" So I put him into hypnosis, got him into that very relaxed state, and said, "What's your body saying to you?" And so it was again about attention. His body knew it couldn't do that psoriasis stuff again, so it was going to make his back hurt. And so he went and he had made sure that there's nothing really wrong with his back. You know, you see all these specialists, nothing's really wrong. So again, he went back to, okay, there's all this emotional stuff. So we went back to a whole lot of trauma that even finding out about the psoriasis, he still had more memories of trauma that he had to clear. And then he cleared that, and he said he never had anything physical, you know, that would be, you know, like unexplained afterwards. And so his body was telling him, "You're not going to listen to me. I'll make it that much worse." And so I started working with people with cancer, and I haven't done anybody with cancer for a few months, but before that, at least one person a month. I find more than one person at a time is really difficult for me. It takes so much energy out of me. And so cancer is very much what's going on in your past, what you have to deal with, what you have to let go of, and and that women who have breast cancer are quite different from people who have other kinds of cancer, and so that becomes significant.
What
And
is the difference?
it's believing that basically believing they're not good enough. There's this belief of women who have cancer have a tendency to have given themselves away so much. And I was trying to think of the phrase, and it's just out of my head right now, but there was a phrase I would hear from women with cancer that I never heard from anybody else, but it was to do with I'm just not enough. And I've given so much of myself away. There's nothing else left. And people with other kinds of cancer don't have that same approach. It was really, it's but it's very much emotional, very much um, turning their pain inward. So if they're not going to deal with their emotional pain, their body will make them pay attention. And um, I mean, I very much believe that many cancers are caused by physical issues. I mean, the poisons we eat, the poisons we drink, and all that kind of stuff. But that does not explain why some people get certain kinds of cancer compared to others. And so there's an emotional difference between where the cancer hits. And that's my feeling, my observation. And so you have to deal with whatever emotional stuff is holding you back from being healthy to letting it go.
I do agree, Dorothy. I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2017. And a lot of people ask me, especially in this field, what did you learn? What was the outcome? And it's exactly what you said. My pain was so big, and I never dealt with it, and I kept on going back, and I kept on wanting approval and attention from the people that hurt me the most. And to me, cancer was the wake-up call. It was like, okay, you cannot keep doing this anymore. You have to take care of yourself. And exactly what you said, I was the giver. I always gave. I always wanted to help others.
It's anger.
Oh, yeah.
And so I would ask people, how, you know, this happened. What are you feeling? I'm feeling hurt. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling upset. And a breast cancer client would never say, I'm angry.
Mm.
You know, and then, I mean, they might say, yeah, I'm angry, but they don't say it in the same way somehow. So you know, you pay attention to how they say the words and what they're being said. But other people, almost the first emotion they'd say, okay, is, okay, you've got this cancer of your hip, you've got, or cancer of someplace, and it's, what are you feeling? I am so angry. You know, I'm angry at God. I'm angry at the world. I'm angry at, and you talk to a breast cancer client, and it's like, oh yeah, well, and then you say, what about anger? Oh, and every one of them would say some variation of, I am not an angry person. I do not lose my temper. So they're equating losing their temper with releasing anger, instead of the way you release anger is by, first of all, acknowledging it. So if you can't even acknowledge the feeling, how can you release it? And and I talk to people a lot about, you know, that behaviors are not always the same way as acknowledgement. If that makes sense, but it's very, very typical. Women with cancer will completely deny that they're angry. Did you feel that way?
Yeah.
It's just I mean, so much trauma in my childhood, and I think there was a sense of helplessness that I always wanted to fix, and I couldn't. And I did
Helplessness,
become
and
the scapegoat at
but
the
then it would
time.
be, why aren't you angry at the people who hurt you?
I still don't know if I'm angry. I get moments of frustration,
Hmm.
and I had to detach in such a big way for my
But
own self.
and then it's
I was
also,
angry.
what
Yeah.
is anger? You know, and this idea, angry means I'm yelling, or yelling means, angry means I'm throwing things. For a lot of men, mostly, that's anger. Anger means something will happen and they'll throw a rock through a window or something. But that's not the same as sort of acknowledging, what am I feeling? I am angry. I am angry at my boss because my boss is doing this horrible thing. And it's like, this anger is justified and this anger is appropriate. And if it's acknowledged, it goes away.
It's interesting because through the journey, I definitely had moments, and there was one night that I remember that I was really angry, and my poor husband. And I felt extremely alone. I felt very abandoned, which was not a new feeling for me. And my poor husband was just beside himself in consoling me. And I think that was a big release of anger, specifically angry because I've always felt ignored, overlooked, not significant. And yeah,
Which is, yeah, which may be part of why women tend to get breast cancer more than men. Men get, you know, because of a different, uh, I don't know if it's indoctrinated or biological, but um, having raised a daughter and having raised two sons as toddlers, their reactions were so completely, totally different. And and I don't know, you know, my daughter being an only child at that time, you know, if she did something wrong and I looked at her angry, she'd burst into tears and stop whatever she was doing. And my sons could be doing something horrible, and I'd look at them and be angry, and they'd look at their brother and the brother would laugh, and it was like, doesn't matter what mom says. So I don't know. But um, but for sure, and that's where I think the power of Marissa's work is so much, because it's going back to, well, what happened to you when you were a child that you've carried forward? And just the fact that if you have children and you see that a girl child is so different from a boy child, it makes sense that different kinds of events could traumatize them in different kinds of ways. But it's still trauma. It still affects how they think about themselves. It still affects their feeling of I'm not good enough, I'm not powerful enough, I'm not strong enough. And it's it's so amazing that you can learn so much from every client you work with. So
I think what you just said, Dorothy, is so true. You learn from your client, and then you learn about to understand yourself better. Every time a client is sitting in front of you, for me, it becomes so real of how trauma from even before birth, right, Marina? Even before birth can impact this sweet, wonderful, beautiful baby or child or teenager, adult, young mom. To have all kinds of emotional or physical or autoimmune or whatever issue it is, where they take that trauma and they've turned it inside and they really believe that I'm not good enough, I don't belong, I'm not worthy, I'm different, I'm not accepted. And to think, there's so many of us walking around right now that are wounded.
and then if you add on deliberate trauma, if you add on child abuse, if you add on rape, if you add on violence of any kind, this feeling of helplessness and hopelessness is so immense.
that they can't do anything about, right? I can't fix this cancer. And I have so many people my age that are arthritic. They've got arthritis. What have you found out about arthritis? Because I think it's just the answer to everything. Oh, you've got arthritis, right? That's what every doctor says at this age.
Remember, I tend to come from a biology background, right? So I believe a lot of illness have this physical issues as well as this emotional stuff. And but it's not that long ago, maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago, maybe not even that long, they discovered that vitamin D is crucial for a full sleep cycle. And our bodies will only heal physically during the REM cycle of sleep. So the more REM sleep you can have, the better your physical healing will be. And that's partly what we do is help those centers clear out, I think. But there's some fantastic videos about sleep I can send to you, but during sleep you sort of start with this cycle, and it takes 90 minutes to go through a cycle. And at the end of that 90-minute cycle, there's rapid eye movement sleep, and then there's this part of sleep, and then there's all these technical things. But at the end of that 90 minutes, you go through a cycle of REM. And then you go back through the 90 minutes again, then you come through another cycle of REM. And the first cycle of REM is your head and your brain. So it's the most essential for survival. Your brain has to heal. And it goes through the second part. And the second part is your chest, your torso usually. And the third part is your limbs. So if you don't have enough vitamin D, then that third REM cycle will either disappear or be cut short. So then your hands, your legs, your feet can't heal because you're not having REM sleep during the time when your body would heal that section. And then as the vitamin D becomes more deficient, the theory is it then interferes with the cycle where it's healing your body. So Crohn's disease, organ diseases, heart disease, lung disease, your body could heal that, but you're not having that REM part of sleep. And I really believe that when you get rid of a lot of the emotional trauma, that opens up the body to having this better REM sleep. But still, vitamin D deficiency is big. And then the third one, it hits the brain. And that's where, most people with Alzheimer's, they've found to have extremely low levels of vitamin D. And in Canada, anyway, in Ontario, they don't do vitamin D testing I guess in certain conditions they might, but you have to pay for it out of pocket. So most people don't bother. And I talked to so many people, well, what about vitamin D? And they say, oh, I make sure I take, I take 500 units every day. And it's like, well, some of this research is showing you need like 20,000 units, not 500. And so anyway, this was long before I went to RTT. So I had my vitamin D level tested. It was in the spring, and I was about half of what they consider to be the recommended dose. And what they say is recommended is much less than what is considered optimal. And so that summer, I took what I thought was a big hunk of vitamin D supplement. Plus, I made more of an effort to be outside in the morning because usually, I was partially a redhead before I went gray. So I would avoid the sun. I didn't want to burn. I could burn so easily. So I made an effort to actually be in the sunlight, to be in the sunshine, to have sun coming into my eyes. And by the fall, of course, in Canada, you don't get vitamin D from the sun between about October and May. So the only time we can get vitamin D from the sun is that very crucial short summer. So otherwise we, cod liver oil, which they don't hardly recommend to kids because there can be some other problems. But when I was a kid, you had to take cod liver oil every day of the winter. And it didn't have the nice flavorings it had now. It was awful. But anyway, by the fall, when I had my vitamin D tested again, after making a concerted effort to take what I thought was a hefty supplement and be in the sun, I'd raised my level up, but I was still below that sort of minimal level. And it took almost 2 years to get me from, up to an optimal level. And then when I had COVID last Christmas, it completely wiped out my vitamin D.
So Dorothy, as our time is running out
okay,
now,
sorry.
one last message of hope for our viewers.
Okay. Our physiology and our mental facilities are so interconnected. So people shouldn't be surprised that how they think affects how they feel and vice versa. So like if you've had a car accident and you're in pain, of course it's going to affect your emotions and stuff. So it's all intertwined. So.
And how can people get hold of you?
Oh, okay. Well, my email is newyou with ddrew@gmail.com. I do have a website, Drew. I haven't looked it up. Drew, I forget. If you look
I
for,
can get it.
yeah.
DrewNewYou.com. Drew, DREW.
Right.
You.
And otherwise,
EWU.com.
Yeah, if people do a search, Dorothy Drew cancer, my video, I did a video for people, the clients I worked with on cancer. It's about 30 minutes long, and that would come up. And I've also done a little video about using RTT hypnosis and stuff for having had a stroke.
Excellent.
So
excellent.
And I get really, really excited when people can reduce their physical pain by acknowledging their emotional pain.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
That's amazing how connected it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really like your website. Drew Knew You. That's catchy.
Yeah. Very nice. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Fran.
Thank you for asking me. Okay.
You're so welcome, Dorothy. And we will see everybody next time.
See you soon.